be here tonight to open things up. So Larry Herr will do a bit of a review for the Iron 2 age, and then talk about Umeri, and then Randy will talk about Jalul, David about your farmstead or farmsteads in Iron 2. Bogdan will talk to us about figurines, and Tui has taken her seat back there if she wishes. She's scrunching down, though, in the chair, so she may not wish. We might have to ask questions to egg her on. And I was hoping that Gary would be here as well to talk about hinterland sorts of things. Okay, so Larry, begin with you.
Okay. When we talk about the Iron 2, along with its name, it's sort of a continuation of the Iron 1. Now, Larry mentioned that in the Bible, the United Monarchy is part of the Iron 1 period. Okay? That's the way Americans have divided things up. Down to an invasion by an Egyptian pharaoh named Shishak. Some of you may know him as Sheshonk. Maybe that's more euphemous. Sheshonk. Good name for a dog. But this guy came through a lot of Palestine. I have a friend whose dog, his name is Shalmaneser, and came through Palestine and destroyed many cities. And that destruction layer, which is dated to one military campaign, you see, is an ideal way to stop an early period and begin a later period. Many other scholars, especially Israelis, begin the Iron 2 with the United Monarchy. Okay? In other words, they begin at about a century earlier. Their reasons are because the 10th century is a very prosperous one, especially the reign of King Solomon when he built many royal cities. But in the Iron 2, this is also a period of great prosperity. But the thing that characterizes this period the most is the growth of small, all right, Randy, ethnic elements, monarchies, okay? They're called kings in the texts. There are the southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel. In the south of Jordan, we have the Edomites. North of them, the Moabites. Then our region here, the Ammonites. And then north of the Zarqa River, of course, that was territory which was fought over between the Israelites and the Arameans of Damascus. The Bible talks about those battles quite a bit. But it was a time when these people gradually became aware of their own selfness, their ethnic identity. Certainly they had tribal connections or clan connections. Tribes are very fluid. Clans go with one group and then can go to another group back and forth. Tribal system is very fluid, and that's what allowed the adaptability that Sten talked about last time. In the Iron 2 period, they get less adaptable. They have great big capital cities. There is the development of an elite class of bureaucrats, of merchants, people who write their names on seals and then use them on documents. Okay? Kings who write inscriptions, monumental inscriptions, like the Mesha Stele, okay, telling about their conquests. Each one of these groups adopted their own distinctive divinity, which they placed over and above other divinities. In Israel, of course, Judah and North Israel, it was Yahweh. People's names had Yah elements to them. Isaiah, Yah, all right? Elijah or Yah on them, like the Hezekiah, Yah, all these. Over here in the Ammonite country, they used the god's name El, which seems to be another name for their national deity, Milcom, who occurs on some names as well. In Moab, it was Chemosh. Mesha wrote his stele in the praise of the god Chemosh, sounding very much like a Bible writer when he did so, in his sense of piety. And in Edom, it was the god Kaus. So we have these divinities. We have the rise of classes. The prophets in the Bible, of course, talk about the upper class who oppresses the poor. We have many of these similar elements. We have at the same time the development of scripts that are unique to each one of these groups. I wrote my doctoral thesis on how we could tell these scripts apart: Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites, Arameans, Israelites, and so on, Phoenicians. They're all branching off into their own self-awareness. This is in context with the rise of large empires around them. In Mesopotamia, especially the Assyrians. Okay? Assyr, not Syrians. In Syria, we had small states like Damascus, Aleppo, Hama, others like that. The other superpower was, of course, Egypt. Okay? Assyria, toward the end of the Iron II period, died out while Babylon and the Medes rose in Mesopotamia. But Egypt was always there on the other side. This area was in between those two superpowers. It's sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly, all right? The good on one side, the bad on the other, and the ugly caught in between, right? Which way are they to ally themselves? Okay? Are they to ally themselves with the guys over in Mesopotamia or with those guys down in Egypt? Whichever group is stronger, you'll find the bureaucrats going this way and that. The book of Jeremiah is basically the nation of Judah trying to decide which group they're going to identify or they're going to make agreements with. So our small groups are sort of waffling back and forth like that. That's essentially the Iron II. How does Ameri, what role does Ameri play in this? I think we've mentioned several times. In fact, when we were visiting Jalul at the beginning of the excavation, we looked north and we saw the hill of Jawa. We could see a little bump on the horizon of Hesban. And we said, behind that other little bump over there was Ameri. Okay? 3 of these Iron Age sites, Iron II sites in a row, that seem to have guarded the roads that came from the south through the Madaba Plain, either Madaba or Jalul, probably roads went by those 2 cities, into the hill country of Ammon. And so Ameri's strategic role was to guard one of the major routes, possibly the major route because of the presence of water. Or at least probably a long time route. So that was its strategic position. How did it do in performing this? In the early stages of Iron II, apparently not very well, even though there was the water. We saw in the Iron I how Ameri was destroyed relatively easily, I guess, even though they had built these great fortifications. It was not a long siege. Bang. And it was 300 years or so before they began to occupy the site fairly seriously again. But it didn't last long. We have only one phase in a few places. In some, like Field B right now, you go right from the late Iron II, bang, to the Iron I destruction. Only in one place in Field B did we have a little storehouse. And in Field A, we had some walls, Dean, in your square last time. Some walls go between the Iron I destruction and the building of the administrative structures. So what I call a brief stutter of occupation at the site, probably in the 9th century, based on the types of pottery that we have, maybe going into the 8th century also. There may have been things here and there. They simply reused the fortifications of Iron I, if they did at all. It may have been just something like a village. Then again, we seem to have a bit of a hiatus, at least in the 7th century. the time of the great Assyrian peace. You may hear people talking today about the Pax Assyriaca, not the Pax Romana, but the Pax Assyriaca, the Assyrian peace. The Assyrians are supposed to have been very cruel. There's some revisionism going on right now, suggesting that that cruelty comes from, of course, people writing who were enemies of theirs, writing about them. There does seem, at Transjordan, does seem to have prospered during this Assyrian period. Mary was not part of that, apparently, or if it was, only in a small way. That despite the water. However, we should remember that some water comes and goes, too. Right now, there isn't any water in that well. We think it's because of deep drilling in the area, but maybe it's just a rise and a fall of aquifers, too, or a general historical rise and fall. Then in the 6th century, the early part, the first half of the 6th century somewhere, probably around 570, the administrative structure at Mary seems to have been built. Now the reason I'm so precise is because in Field B we have a pit that is under the earliest of 3 or 4 late iron 2 phases in 7K80 and 7K80 mainly, and also 7K90, where some of you are digging today underneath. We had 3 or 4 of these phases, and in one of those pits underneath, and Karen cleaned that out, one of those pits, it wasn't that one, but in one of those pits was an ostracon, our only legible ostracon that we found at Mary. That dates to somewhere in the middle parts of the 6th century. Over that, the walls, you see, of the administrative structure and the buildings associated with them are built. So that is the paleographical date, anyway, which gives us the beginning of our settlement. It has to be earlier than the middle of the 6th century because we have the Baalis seal impression. Baalis was king of the Ammonites in Jeremiah 40 verse 14 in the year 582. Now he probably extended later than that. So somewhere after 582 and before 550, our site was settled. Okay? The other seal impressions that we have, and seals and things, and the pottery seem to suggest similarities. Ammon was destroyed, according to Josephus, in 582 as a result of fostering state terrorism. Baalis was a state terrorist. I'm using this word very loosely, Randy. He fostered a Judean prince to kill the Babylonian appointed governor, Gedaliah, whose capital was in Mizpah, north of Jerusalem. In 582, the Babylonians came down, destroyed Judah again for the 3rd time, and also came over here to Ammon, according to Josephus, and destroyed Ammon. My thesis is that our main settlement of late iron 2 / early Pur, was founded at this time as an Ammonite governmental administrative center to repopulate and rework this land. And I'm not going to steal David's thunder because he's going to take off from there. Okay? But I hope. He'll tell you why. But that lasted for quite a while. We have lots of pottery from this. In fact, there was no destruction which brought in the Persian period. That's totally consistent with what the Persians did elsewhere as well. Mary just kept going. They reused the same buildings. Sometime in the Persian period, they laid a new floor in the administrative complex, but no big deal. It went on. And how far into the Persian period, we aren't sure. Perhaps as late as the early 4th century. But if it did, it wasn't going very strongly. But our site was primarily an administrative site. There's quite a bit of evidence that the population was not large. They lived north of Field A and H. Field H is coming up with the greatest administrative buildings we have so far. Mary Boyd's wall, almost 2 meters wide. And nothing but walls in Ava Viviorca's, I think, and so on. So it's a big complex there. But the people who worked in those and the servants who probably served them are in the north part of Field A and in Field B. That's my why. Who's next?
Randy, too.
And Mary, having 5 seasons, has a nicer picture to paint with more stratigraphy, more precision. Larry's given a nice background of the historical context in which everything has taken place at Mary. I suppose one thing I could add, starting with the Persian and working back maybe, is that even in the hinterland, we've discovered that, like at Rejad, at Rujim Salim in particular, that was one of our unique discoveries of a couple of seasons ago out there. I think it was just before you joined us, David, but we discovered that the Iron Age did not come to an abrupt end, but there did seem to be sort of a continuous occupation at several of these smaller sites out in the hinterland into the Persian period without any kind of a break at all. So there's quite a bit of activity going on. There's sort of a continuity of occupation, and that was, I think, rather a surprise. People sort of thought the Ammonites just were blotted off the face of the earth, I think, prior to that, and there was a big question, where were the Ammonites? In fact, what happened to all the Transjordanian people? And the thing is, apparently nothing happened to them. They continued living on, clear on down, who knows, to the Nabatean period, perhaps. Because of their tribal structure, which was a substructure, without getting into all the semantics of what is a state and not a state, regardless of how you want to labor their most sophisticated social organization, their peak in the Iron II period, their tribal resilience, that was sort of an understructure of the society all the way through all these periods, allowed them a tremendous amount of resilience, and has new situations confronted them in the Persian period and in the Hellenistic period. They were able to adapt, absorb, maybe adopt new tribal groups or new people groups, or they were able to go join other groups. Eventually that Ammonite identity may have been lost very, very late. We don't know exactly when. But it wasn't an abrupt thing, not some kind of a dramatic destruction or something at the end of the Iron II, as we might have previously thought. I'm going to move because I can't see with the sun shining. And that points up, I suppose, one other quick point I'll make, and then we'll do a quick thing on Jalul, of the resiliency of tribal society in general. Tribal societies, when they have a challenge that confronts them, they can react one of two ways, and Sten may expound on this a bit more, he's already mentioned it, but they can either go to ground, so to speak. If they have a big empire like the Assyrians confronting them or challenging them, they can either all disappear into the desert and live in a Bedouin, pastoral, nomadic kind of an existence, or if the situation is friendly enough, they may actually go the opposite direction. They may coagulate, they may concentrate, and they can actually develop a very sophisticated society that may mirror the society that they're working with or under. And the whole history of Jordan documents what happens to tribal peoples when an outside power comes in. You have this in the Roman period, you have it as recently as the Ottoman or the Turkish period. People, if times were too tough in the Turkish period, they would disappear out into the desert to avoid paying taxes. If that superpower, that empire, was more friendly, they might actually become more sedentary, and they'll adjust their tribal structure to meet that particular condition. If it's a beneficial situation, they'll actually maybe come together, settle down, and try and take advantage of the situation. And that's apparently exactly what happened during the Assyrian and the Babylonian, even into the Persian period. Larry mentioned it was the peace of Assyria. And apparently that was conducive to the Ammonites and the Moabites and even the Edomites in the latter part of the Iron Age, all settling down and creating very sophisticated tribal kingdoms. I like to use the word. You can call them monarchies. And they were very prosperous during that time. That was, in a sense, the golden age of those peoples in Transjordan. And apparently they cooperated and flourished under the Assyrian Empire much more than did their neighbors to the west, who seemed to have more rebellious thoughts. And they got whomped on more over there, apparently, than the people did over here. These people went more with flow, and they seemed to succeed as a result. And again, I think that was a benefit of their tribal resilience. Going back now specifically to Jalul, again, we don't have a lot we can say. Clearly, places like Jalul, there's something that anthropologists refer to as central place theory. That's where you look at a settlement pattern, you look at the distribution of sites, their size, and how they relate to each other. And oftentimes you'll see a settlement hierarchy. And certainly, we're not seeing much in the Jalul survey so far. I can't help, Gary's not here, but I can't help but think there had to be some support system out there. But the fact is, Jalul's a pretty good sized site in the Iron II, apparently. We're just, again, scratching the surface now. But it seems like it had to be an important regional center of some sort. And as we continue to dig, hopefully we'll get more of an eye on that. So it was a key site in that particular area. It's right on the border, again, between the Ammonite what was traditionally the Ammonite hill country in which Umeri and Jawa, those sites are located, and the plain proper, the northern Moabite territory. It's right in the middle of that. And so it's a border site involved with a lot of activity, a lot of political, social, and other types of upheavals and changes. Our first season, we immediately came down upon Iron 2 material, which was rather exciting. The curious thing was, though, that in fields A and B last season, we didn't find any of the late stuff. The late Iron 2, like 7th, 6th century, nor did we find any of the Persian material at all. And we were convinced that there was a gap between Jalul and Umeri, that somehow whatever terminated Jalul, we still don't know for sure what it was, it seemed to just have quit, and there was sort of a gap, and places like Hesban, just a few kilometers north, seemed to be occupied during that later period, and was Umeri. This season, however, we were surprised, and I suppose we could say pleased, though, we closed that gap. We're now finding some of the very same types of late pottery that are found in Umeri. We're finding a lot of this blackware, this very nice stuff. We're finding stuff from the 7th and 6th century. We're also finding some Persian pottery as well. So apparently there was not a major occupational gap. All of these sites apparently went from the Iron 2 into what some people call the Iron 3 of the Persian period in sort of a continuous fashion. There were some disruptions in settlement, though. Between the 8th century and the 7th, 6th centuries, there appears to have been a major destruction at Jalul. Again, we can't say much. We do have that big lower roadway, and it's covered with 20, 30 centimeters, not more than about 20 centimeters of ash. And we found it, evidence of it, in 2 of the fields, A and B. So there seems to have been a big destruction between what you might call the middle Iron 2 and the latter part of the Iron 2. Again, we don't have enough specifics to tie it to a historical event. And then we have an earlier Iron 2 occupation in the 9th century. That's our lowest pavement. I was actually referring to the upper pavement a moment ago. And again, it was destroyed, apparently towards the end of the 9th century. So we know that there's occupation. We mentioned last lecture that we had a big destruction at the end of Iron 1, lots of collar rim jars, carbonated bowls from the Iron 1 and so forth. It picked up again in the early Iron 2 period. It seemed to have thrived for about a century. It was destroyed. And then it picked up again in the middle part of the Iron 2. The 8th century, it was destroyed. And then we've got this occupation going through the 7th, 6th, and into the Persian period. More than that, we can't say right now. We're just now starting to find some significant architecture, some big buildings and so forth, which you'll hear more about and see next week. But we think it's going to be a key site in helping us understand this critical Iron 2 period.
Imagine if you could move back in time and stand on the summit of either Tel Jalul or Tel Umeri or Tel Hesban. And you were standing looking out at the horizon all the way around. At Hesban, you could actually see you could see all the way around for kilometers in every direction. The same is true at Jalul. But at Umeri, you could only see really toward the east because of the hill to the back. And here, you're looking out. What did the landscape look like? Chances are, not chances, I think that we can say on the basis of the study of the animal bones and of the survey results that during the Iron 1 period, as you're standing there looking out, you would see more forests than you see today. You would probably see quite a few more cattle than sheep and goat out there grazing on the slopes of these around there. And you would see a lot of wheat being grown in the Iron 1 period. You would also see a smattering of little settlements, but really relatively few compared to what you will see in the Iron 2 period. And so what would you see in the Iron 2 period standing on the summit of any one of these 3 sites? Well, down at Jalul, my impression on the basis of the survey that we have is that probably what you would see are many teams of oxen out there plowing those vast fields. I don't think that you would see a lot of small villages. Jalul seemed to have been a place in Iron 2 where that sort of is where the workers lived. Now, if you went to Umeri, you would see a lot of smaller villages. In fact, between Iron 1 and Iron 2, it seems that the settlement at Umeri shrinks and becomes smaller, becomes an administrative center, while the hinterland fills up with lots of little smaller farm sites, including some larger sites that we're going to hear about from David Hopkins. So now you would see quite a few villages. We are still looking for the cave sites from these periods. I'm sure they were used, but we just simply have not been able to find those yet. We know caves were used in all the later periods. But anyhow, in addition to these settlement changes, you would also see land use changes. You would see many more fruit trees being produced, especially olives and grapes. You would see many more donkeys on the slopes, because donkeys and mules are better adapted to plowing in the hills, and perhaps relatively fewer teams of oxen, which now are reserved just for the valley bottoms where they were growing wheat. Surely a difference that you would notice in the landscape is that in Iron 1, the landscape was not by any means as intensively cultivated as it clearly would have been in Iron 2. So in Iron 2, then we get a trajectory toward intensification, which goes right along with greater sedentarization. And now, as we've just heard, this peak that was reached in the, 6th century about, there here, seems to have then gradually tapered off rather than just suddenly collapsed. And as that peak tapers off, what gradually happened is that you see a diminishing in the maintenance of terraces and tree crops, and gradually people revert to keeping, to producing sheep and goat and grains. Why? Because sheep and goat and grains can be produced with less sort of infrastructure of protection and so forth. When you plant a tree, you need more political stability than they were able to guarantee by the 5th, 4th century and so forth. So that's kind of what you would see if you were to have been able to live for about a span of 600-700 years during the Iron 1, Iron 2. A build-up in settlement and land use intensity and a gradual tapering off, correlated with which is a gradual increase in the denudation of the landscape. That is, with each of these cycles of intensification, it seems people cut back more trees in order to cultivate more slopes. But as the population declines as a consequence of the downturn, people are not able to continue to maintain these nice hillsides that they have terraced. And the terraces now start to be neglected, and yet you have the sheep and goat grazing on them, which prevents new forest from establishing itself. And so this cycle then, by the end of the Iron Age, you have a greater cutting back of the forests, and we are getting closer to the kind of barrenness that you see today. The following cycle, which was the most intense yet, is the Roman-Byzantine cycle, which pretty well cleared all the forests away. And that we will talk about next time.
David, can I come down off the top of Tell It, O Mary? Yeah. Actually, I want to go up a little higher and rehearse real quickly 2 fundamental points that Larry, I think, outlined, just so you can understand how tiny the farmstead that I've been excavating is. The 2 fundamental points, if you go up a little higher, say a Landsat version, relative to the geography of Palestine. Larry already mentioned that Palestine is a crossroads place, and that's quite true, not only connecting Egypt and Assyria, but also the whole Mediterranean basin with the Eastern Africa and Arabia. As a crossroads place, it's strategically important to control. However, Palestine has absolutely no intrinsic value. There's nothing here that anyone wants to possess to any great degree. So that Palestine becomes a place that one wants to control, but not necessarily a place that one needs to absorb into one's own system. There are times when that does happen, and that Egypt absorbs Palestine, or Palestine is absorbed into the Roman world. But for most of its history, it has allowed a certain measure of autonomy. And so this balance between trying to being a place where you're going to feel some measure of the impact of the larger powers, but still be allowed a little autonomy, is quite crucial for the life of the country. The second point has to do with a little closer look at the fractionalization of Palestine. It's a geographically extraordinarily diverse region. Any kind of entities, social entities that we talk about here, are necessarily going to be kind of smaller groupings. the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Israelites, the Judites. These are very, very small entities we're talking about, and that has to do with the geographical fractionalized nature of the country. This makes a further related point, I think, and that is that even the societies within these smaller entities are fractionalized. So that if you looked at the society of the Ammonites, you would see, as Larry has mentioned, in the Iron II period, you would see a very small elite population that lived primarily in the cities. Also in the cities with these elite were what I would call townspeople who served the elite, the bureaucrats and the retainers and the servants and other kinds of folk necessary to keep the elite from having to do any work. That was the nature of being the elite, I think. You didn't have to work. You wouldn't have hands like we have hands now, if you were part of the elite. So you have this small segment of the elite, a little bit larger segment of townspeople. The vast majority of the population did not live at Tel El-Omeri or Tel Jalul, but lived in the hinterlands. Maybe 90% of the population did so. And they lived in two categories, either as villagers and farmers or as pastoralists. And so you do have this highly segmented and stratified, fractionalized society. In fact, it's probably a mistake to call the Ammonites a society in the way that we would use the word today. It's probably more safe, I believe, to call it a plural society. It certainly wasn't a nation in the way we understand nations to have existed today. Anyway, the farmstead. Farmstead manifests both these geographical facts about Palestine. It manifests both the place of Palestine in the world historical situation, and it manifests the fractionalization of Palestinian society. Because when we went out to look at farmsteads in the hinterland, what we thought we were going to find were the places where people who worked the land lived. I want to find a farmstead, where Ma and Pa and the kids, all 14 of them, struggled to eke out an existence, just like we did on the old prairie and all the rest of that stuff. Well, what has been discovered at the farmstead which I've excavated is not such a dwelling at all. It does not appear to be a domestic dwelling of a single family of farm laborers. Rather, if it is a domestic dwelling, it is a family of managers who manage the labor of the farm. And the reason I say that is several. One is the size of this building. It stretches about the length of those four doors and then out about the same to where that wall starts. It's about 8 meters by 8 meters, made of large stones, so it seems to be a product of a vast sort of energy. Second, the goods inside it include such things as seals, stamp seals that are used not for the production of agricultural commodities, but for the distribution and regulation and administration of agricultural commodities. So it does not appear to be just a simple farmstead where a family lived, but to be more like a manager's estate. The other thing that's crucial about the farmstead is that it is not really a farming place, it is a place of horticulture. The slopes of this larger farm, which is bounded by a perimeter wall, are absolutely littered with installations having to do with the production of wine or grape juice, depending upon your preferences. Absolutely, it couldn't be grape juice in the ancient world because fermenting is hard to stop, no refrigeration. In any case, no vacuum containers. So the production of wine takes place at this farmstead. There are 4 or 5 wine presses on the hills. There are huge troughs cut into the hills. There are terrace walls that remain for the production of wine. So you have a wine-producing estate. Now, wine-producing estates are, by definition, not subsistence cultivators. Subsistence cultivators cultivate grains and maybe a little fruit, maybe a vegetable garden, and some have some lamb occasionally, once a year for dinner. But they are not involved in the production of wine. Wine is produced for a market-oriented society. And what would the Ammonites in the Iron II period want to do with the creation of wine? Well, that brings us back to the international context. Wine is the sole way where this society could enter into international commerce. There's nothing really else of value here that can make its way to market. Olive oil, but we don't have any indication that Iron II period produced much olive oil in this land. Later on, Hellenistic Roman, lots of olive oil. Byzantine, lots and lots of olive oil. But in Iron 2, it is wine. Wine gets you into the international commerce system. Why do you want to be in the international commerce system? Well, if you're an elite person, you want to be in there because you want the preciosities that international commerce affords you. We haven't found too many preciosities, I don't think.
What is a preciosity?
It's a precious thing that moves from one place to
I
another.
thought it was a bone, an os.
Exotic
Anyway.
goods.
That's right. You want preciosities. These things are very light in weight, easily transported, high in value. And you also want to enter enter the international commerce market because you have to pay something. What you have to pay is tribute. We talk about the Pax Assyriaca. Well, it's a pax, but it's a pax at a cost, and the cost are huge volumes of tribute that pour out of Palestine to Assyria. Earlier periods poured out of Palestine to Egypt, and I assume also poured out of Palestine into the Persian Empire. That tribute, if you read the treaties and whatnot, is oftentimes, or more than not, demanded in goods that are not indigenous to this region. They want black wood from Africa, they want gold, they want precious stones. They do not want things that grow here. So you have to go into the international market in order to acquire the things that the Pax Assyriaca government wants you to produce. In the Iron II period, they're doing that, I think, in the Persian environment. So what we have in this farmstead is not a farmstead at all, but an adjunct of the administration of the rural land by the folks living at Umeri. The pottery, according to our ceramic expert here, is almost identical in many respects. Adjunct to their management of the production of wine for market.
Could I tag on to your comments by noting that you guys are either throwing away the bones or you're not getting many?
We're not getting any.
And that fact is conspicuous to me, and only adds weight to your interpretation that this is not your typical sort of mom and pop farm place where sheep and goat are slaughtered, and other animals for food. In fact, it seems it maybe even puts into question whether the place was even used as a dwelling per se. Perhaps it was more a kind of an administrative center where you had all kinds of jars stored, and you had people with seal impressions that could authorize the trade and movement of these things into the international market. So I just wanted to add that it surely looks like this is not just a typical farm, even from the absence of any animal bones.
Bogdan, tell us about figurines, Iron 2.
Well, maybe also a comment to what David said. One of these exotic, maybe goods, it could be some figurines. Last season we found an amulet, which looks like imported either from the Delta, from Egypt, or from Phoenicia. We also had cylinder seals with Egyptian, typically clear Egyptian iconography, and another cylinder seal with iconography very close to a seal found in Tel El Taidia in the Jordan River, Jordan Valley. Well, about the figurines, I would abandon the term figurines for many reasons, and the most important one is that it is so broad term, incorporating so many things, that you just losing what really is going on when you find something which do not fit to Larry's pottery reading. We call figurines everything which has a different form than a rim, a base, or something like that. And why is that so? Maybe because of some our need for exotic material, I would say. What are these elements we call, fragments we call figurines? I would prefer to call it just terracottas. Okay, they can be I would call figurines proper. Free standing figures of human figures, animal figures, just by itself. So I would use the term figurine for just that form. But this is only about 50% of these anthropomorphic and zoomorphic forms we find at Tel el-Umeiri, Jalul, and other sites. Only 50%. What is the other part? The other part are anthropomorphic and zoomorphic and maybe botanomorphic motifs attached to vessels, attached to ceramic stands. We can even say that this was a cultic stand, or attached to house models or temple models. What else? Some of these forms can be even other terracotta objects like rattles. We have anthropomorphic rattles from Transjordan. They can be miniature wheel charts or wheeled animals. So these are the forms we just put into one bag and call figurines. Where are they found? Well, we dig mostly in, I guess, late Iron II, so we have mostly late Iron II figurines. Maybe this is not because, I would say that once we go deeper, we'll have also figurines from other periods, but possibly this is one of the most fruitful periods, I mean, in terms, speaking about figurines. They were mostly found in Field A, well, because I guess the greatest activity is going there, and this is all the late Iron II stuff is over there, but maybe because also of the administrative center, which is there. But we also find figurines in hinterland. We found something in Dave's farmstead, in another farmstead several years ago in Rujim Salim. So figurines are not objects just attached to town, to towns, to cities, so to speak. What is their function in these terms? Where? Definitely they were of religious function. There is a discussion if some of them, maybe some of them were toys, but well, most scholars think they were of religious function, but not of official religion. They represent household religion. Most of them. They are found in houses. They are also found in official buildings, like in Field A. They are found in temples. They are found in tombs, everywhere, almost everywhere. So this is not something which is attached to just one special place. Within the religious function, they represented votive, I would say, offerings, or votive offerings within a household shrine, or larger family shrine, or city shrine, and so forth. This is also a discussion going on if they represented that human figurines, if they represented gods. Well, if they were votive, they didn't. So gods were represented maybe in other material, but not in clay. Clay was used just within the family for votive offerings. For example, animals, female bearing a child, female holding breasts, these kind of things usually suggest that this is a fertility, I would say, function. I mean, they were produced because of that, because of the need for fertility within humans and human population and within the animal population. Well, I guess that's
I would like at this moment to usurp the chair. Doug almost never speaks at these things, but I know he's written an excellent paper on the family in the Iron II period. And I'd like for us to demand to give some sort of sociological flesh and blood to these bones that we have been doing.
Well, actually, that paper was more on Iron 1.
Just summarize
But,
it, but it holds for Iron II as well.
Sure. This will be quick, and this will be interesting. I'll be surprised at what I have to say at putting this together on a moment's notice.
He honestly did not know I was going to do
This is the truth. It is the case. Actually, I'm dependent on the paper that I did on work that Carol Myers has done, and also a piece on archaeology of family by Steger. And what I wanted to try to explore were dimensions of the family and see if, in fact, we couldn't discover something particularly about women's roles. That was what was driving me. And it was more Iron 1, but there are a lot of the dynamics that spill over into Iron 2 as well. What I wanted to sort out was the role of women in a society that would be agrarian. I wanted to compare the role of women in families in an agrarian setting as opposed to more an urban setting. And in an agrarian setting, I think anthropologists, and I think those certainly those two sources that I just referred to, are consistent in saying that women's roles were much more significant. And even the use of the word roles these days is a problem. I know, but it's old language, but I'll use it anyway. But women's roles were much more significant in an agrarian society where they were more actively participating in food production, in clothing production, in all of those things, where a woman's role was more actively a part of a rural setting. Whether it is in the kinds of things I mentioned, food production and clothing and so on. Also, evidently, worship settings. In an agrarian setting, women's roles in worship seem to be more significant. And I don't know if Tui is going to get into this or not, but I do think, as we have talked in the past about figurines, I mean, you think about the fact that even though the biblical record speaks so strongly against these images of one kind or another that are human and that particularly represent fertility, they are everywhere in Israelite sites. That has to say something about women's roles and the significance and the centrality of women's roles, especially in agrarian society. Once you move from an agrarian society to an urban society where men control the economy, where men control worship, think about who functions in temples. It's men. Women's roles are decreased dramatically. And so I wanted to play with this. And I also wanted to play with the notion that perhaps even many of the biblical metaphors which we think about in relationship to God, and in Israel you have one God, male. In most other societies you've got male and female deities. But in Israel, you have all of these metaphors in Scripture which God appropriates, which are feminine. And you have terms, I don't know even where to go with them. I mean, there's been more study done recently, but with terms like Shaddai. Is it mountains? Is it breasts? You think about the very notion of mercy.
Shaddai is the name translated Almighty.
Yes, the Almighty. You think about terms like mercy in the Old Testament, racham, which is a direct derivative of rechem, which means womb. And here God has the kind of compassion for his people that only a mother can have. And then you have the sitting hen, and so on. You also have, at least two different periods in Israelite history, one of them Iron II, at Kuntilat Ajrud in the northern Sinai, you have evidently Israelites worshiping Yahweh and his Asherah and his consort spouse. So what I wanted to do with family was to try to sort out women's roles in particular, and that within the context of rural and urban settings. And it does seem to me that in rural settings, especially early Iron I, where you've got the time of the judges, where you've got small villages on the West Bank in Palestine, you have women playing a much more active role and much more participatory. They are much more a part of the system. And they, as urbanization takes place, as sedentarization takes place, take more and more the backseat.
But also, they were pregnant or having young children with them most of their lives.
And I'd add to that too. Thank you, Larry, for suggesting that we ought not have too idyllic a picture of life in the Iron Ages. If half, at least according to the statistics I'm aware of, if half of your children survived past their earliest years, you were fortunate. All kinds of. Anyway, we think about the wind. We worry about the dust. We worry about a few things. We've got medication though. Should any of these things hit us, the Alibaba's revenge or whoever, we have ways to handle that. They didn't. And so you've got plagues, you've got pestilence, you've got all kinds of diseases. These diseases, incidentally, many of them are showing up in, of all places, latrine archaeology, where, you search through and you find outhouses, and in the remains, all kinds of things. Tapeworm eggs are virtually indestructible. So a whole, I don't know if it's something you want to get into professionally for a long period of time, but at any rate, there are possibilities. And we just know a lot about life, not just the family, but I mean just everyday life. It's something that we have idealized, and we need to be more realistic about it.
Could I demand that Larry Herr now give a recreational analysis of
Okay, I would like to. The average age of people when they died from the early Bronze Age, from the Chalcolithic early Bronze Age until Turkish times, was 35 to 38. 35 to 38. It was remarkable to reach my age of, 39, 47. All right? We have a few who are in their 50s, even less in their 60s. Maybe at a Mary we found the grandfather of them all who has his molars worn down to the gums. But this is very rare. Average age 35. Half of the children in the cemeteries, half of the burials in cemeteries, and these are mass cemeteries, hundreds of people, are juvenile or younger. Okay? By juvenile, I mean prepubescent, okay? Or younger. And so you had a roughly 50-50 chance after being successfully born
That's due to
to
the
reach
hardships of the food system.
adulthood.
And let's make the further point that you're talking about the elite, who are the only graves that we've really discovered.
That too. Yeah, every appendicitis victim died. We have evidence of very people really trying hard to save themselves. They actually sawed holes in their skulls to relieve pressure. If you go to the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, you'll see that. You'll also see that the skull began to heal for a while, so that this guy lived for a few weeks afterwards, this guy or this woman. But when you die at age 35, you have to produce the next generation very quickly. So women married young, probably at puberty. Men were older because they had to have the means to support their wives. Men did not live probably long enough, very frequently, to see their children reach adulthood. Many women did not either. There were thus many orphans. The Bible talks about orphans. The Bible talks about widows because the women were so much younger than the men. Women marrying at age 12, 13, 14 at the oldest bearing children within a year of that date, and every year after that date, because the more children you had, the better a wife you were, and the more virulent a man you were.
Virulent?
Yes. Whatever. You get my point. You get my point, right? This was life. And so these women would have been going working in the fields, because women did this, with a baby on their backs. We have paintings in the Egyptian tombs of this happening. And pregnant. They would have been pregnant or having very young children most of their lives. Think of that, ladies. No archaeological digs, stay at home, work in the field, probably never much get outside of a few square kilometers around your home. So, Sten asked me to talk about the leisure of women. 0. Okay? To use General Akash's famous statement. 0. It was the men who had the leisure. Yeah, all right. Thank you, ladies.
Questions, comments? Over here, Ken.
Would you draw a distinction between a kingdom and a non-kingdom? What makes a kingdom a kingdom? You keep saying these things weren't kingdoms, yet they have tendencies towards being kingdoms, even as early as the story of Nahash the Ammonite, who wants to take control of Jabesh Gilead and not absorb the people, but force them into submission.
Okay, there are some definitions that can separate. One of the attributes of a kingdom is the keeping of a standing army. Now that seems to be something that separates just a typical tribal group from a kingdom. And so, for example, tribal groups will arm themselves and go to war, but they are not keeping a standing army. That is a professional army set aside for the very purpose of making war. And that is one thing that really sets it apart. A second thing would be that there is some kind of monumental structure that goes along with the recognition of power and so forth. And now, mind you, you can have a kingdom and still have the tribal structure. But I think that the important thing about a kingdom is that it is much more embracing. It reaches beyond the network that a tribe typically is capable of to incorporate a number of clans and tribes. So that would be a second or third attribute of a kingdom. So the keeping of a standing army, the significant element of monumental works, and the third, the broader reach of the solidarity that is provided by this kind of a thing. And Randy, you want to add some other?
Well, I'd modify it slightly. What I was saying 2 nights ago, I guess it was, monumental architecture actually has nothing to do with it. And the distinction we're talking about is not kingdom. Kingdom is not an important word. Kingdom can mean anything. The key is a state.
Yeah.
State is a very specific term used in anthropological circles that implies a non-kinship-based, complex society that is usually pluralistic, multi-ethnic. It has a whole bunch of very specific attributes. There is no indication that any of the societies in Palestine had those entities yet. A kingdom, Saudi Arabia, if you think about it, is technically not a state anthropologically, even though it's a modern society. They fly F-16 jets from the United States. But you look at how their society is structured, and that's what we're talking about. They have a kinship-based society. Everyone's position in that society of Saudi Arabia is determined by the relationship to the other people around them, a biological relationship or a perceived biological relationship. All the people running the government there are related to the king. In a true state society like the United States, you genuinely have a multi-ethnic groups. You have a very complex society, all sorts of institutions that are competing with each other or cooperating with each other. The government is non-kinship based. Generally, we frown upon it when the president hires too many of his brothers or cousins or wives or whatever, to run things. So that's what we're talking about. Assyria, anthropologists who have studied Assyria and Mesopotamian societies feel, yes, they did actually achieve a state-level society. Egypt probably achieved a state-level society. Canaan, the land of Canaan worked within that as a subset of the greater state societies. They were never a state, though. Canaan was probably never a state. The people of Transjordan were probably, in and of themselves, never able to arise to this state society. They saw themselves basically as an integrated, homogeneous group. And that would be an indication that they're a kin-based group. All the language we have of the literature, such as the Bible, is just permeated with kinship-based language. You have tribes, clans, family, the house of the father. All of this is very typical of sub-state societies, but not state-level societies. The key word is state, not kingdom. You can have tribal kingdoms, and Saudi Arabia technically probably is a tribal kingdom.
But Randy, you will also agree that there is a transition in Transjordan, say in the Iron Two, into a broader-based group than just the tribe, in the sense that you get at least there's a greater...
You can call it tribal confederacy. There can be a shake of sheikhs, but I'm not sure you can argue that you had a
You do not have the
full-fledged
the non-kinship based
society, right?
Other questions? Whoa.
That was enough to put everyone to sleep.
Well, we want to thank all of you participants for helping us through.